In this video, I just want to talk a little bit more about the EI restrictions. Out of the new rules, it's the one that has the most, and it's helpful to understand the justification for the restrictions in order to help you remember what they are. Now, here's a clearly invalid argument, and that's why the conclusion indication is in red, is just to remind us that this is an invalid argument. And if there's any question about its invalidity, we can turn it into an ordinary language argument and analyze it that way. So the premise says something like, let's use is a Grammy winner for the predicate letter G, in which case we're looking at a premise like this. There are Grammy winners. Okay. And let's use C for Kathy, in which case the conclusion is Kathy is a Grammy winner. This premise is clearly true. There are lots of Grammy winners, in fact, but the conclusion is clearly and obviously false. And beyond the fact that I've given a counterexample here, the thing to remember is that arguments are inference patterns. Premises are supposedly evidence for the conclusion. And just think about this, because this is crucial to understanding the restrictions on EI. From the fact that there are Grammy winners, we cannot know who those Grammy winners are. Right? As evidence, even though the premise is true, it's just not enough support to tell us who those Grammy winners are. I'll put it this way. Right? Beyonce has won something like, I don't know, a ton of Grammys, right? So here, the conclusion is true, but this reasoning pattern is still horrendous, because on the basis of knowing that there are Grammy winners, we cannot then know that Beyonce is one of them, even though she has in fact won lots of Grammys. Now you may be wondering, having looked at this sort of awful kind of reasoning, is why EI is permitted at all. And that's actually a really good question, and it's because we can know from the generalization that there are Grammy winners that some specific individual, and again, in an unrestricted domain, I just mean a thing, some specific, concrete thing, or things, is a Grammy winner. That is to say, we can correctly move from the generalization to a singular sentence. That reasoning is good reasoning. The mistake, if you will, right, the change, if you will, from that first clearly invalid kind of reasoning to this second actually clearly valid kind of reasoning, this is an analogy, so just take it as such, but it's like we can know that there are specific individuals that are Grammy winners from the generalization, but we just can't know their actual names. So it's almost like we need to use a pseudonym when we instantiate, right? From the evidence that there are Grammy winners, we can then conclude that Jane Doe, as a generic pseudonym of a specific individual, though, right, that Jane Doe is a Grammy winner. That's okay. Kathy's a Grammy winner is not okay. That Beyonce's a Grammy winner is not okay, right? But this version of the singular sentence that does pick out a specific individual, again, it's just by analogy, it's like we can't know their actual name, though, right, is valid reasoning. And in effect, that's what all of these restrictions mean. In its most basic way, this is why instantiation with a variable is not permitted with EI, because remember, variables are just placeholders. Variables are variable after all. Kind of imagine just like a ever-changing, chain of individuals, and we're just shifting along them. Whereas what we're trying to do with this kind of reasoning is we're trying to say, no, there's, from the generalization, we know that there's some specific individual, at least one, that meets this description. But again, we sort of don't know their name, as it were. And in essence, these two restrictions exist to make sure that we are using kind of, again, this is only analogy, but sort of a pseudonym for that specific individual. And in effect, these restrictions just ensure that we are in fact using again, by analogy, sort of a pseudonym for that specific individual. So let's take a look at both of these in turn, and I'm actually going to look at the second one first. Without that restriction in place, then line 2 here, as it appears, would be legal. It's clearly a piece of invalid reasoning, and so we sort of don't want it to be legal. This, the fact that the conclusion can't contain the instantial letter for EI is a way of ensuring that we aren't reasoning about a specific named individual, and that we're keeping this sort of like a generic or sort of a pseudonym for a specific individual. And the reason why it does it is because if the conclusion names a specific individual, then we're no longer talking about a Jane Doe, right? We're talking about Kathy, and my name, so to say. Right? So this second restriction here ends up being one of two checks. One is, as it's stated, the line that indicates the conclusion of the argument, which is usually your last premise. Okay, make sure that the instantial letter that you're choosing is not a name that appears in the conclusion indicator. Correct, but I think the easier way to check is just to think about it in terms of the conclusion, right? That is to say, I think the easier way to check is just to make sure that you're not ending your proof. I should probably use red. That you're not ending your proof with an instantial letter that you got from EI. To talk about that first restriction, we need another premise. And again, I'm just going to make this as simple as possible, just so it'll be a very silly argument. Okay, so I'm talking about this restriction here. Okay, so for example, let's try to prove this argument. And again, to maybe hear the invalidity a little bit, let's still use G for is a Grammy winner. So premise number one is still there are Grammy winners. Okay, let's let N be is a NASCAR driver, so there, there are NASCAR drivers. Okay, both of these are true. See where I'm going with this? And our putative conclusion is some Grammy winners are NASCAR drivers. Okay, and that's I don't think it's obviously false, but it is false. Okay, and again, more importantly, it's about the inference, right? It's about the reasoning here. And from the fact that there are Grammy winners and that there are NASCAR drivers, that's just not good enough evidence to support the claim that there is anything that has both of those qualities, right? Both of those properties. And so we shouldn't be able to prove this argument valid. But without this restriction in place, without this idea of sort of maintaining pseudonyms, if you will, we would be able to derive it, and it would look like this. So let's use J for Jane Doe even. And we use EI on line 1, and we find that we have not used a variable, and we have satisfied this second requirement since the conclusion doesn't contain any individual constants. And we've also satisfied that first one because so far in the proof, that's to say in lines 1 and 2, we don't have any individual constants at all. Now the violation occurs at line 4. Let's try to instantiate on line 2, and let's still use Jane Doe. Okay, and let me finish the putative proof before going back and recapping exactly what has gone wrong here. And so then, of course, we simply conj lines 3 and 4, and then we generalize over the sentence at the formula at line 5, and we get our conclusion, but this is an invalid, this should not be derivable, and in fact it's not. If we go back to the Jane Doe or the pseudonym analogy, what happened here, what went wrong here, is that when we get to line 3 and we make a claim about Jane Doe being a Grammy winner, she's no longer an unknown specific individual. She's that Grammy-winning Jane Doe. And so then when we get to line 4 and we try to say, oh, and not only is she a Grammy winner, this pseudonym unknown specific individual, not only is she a Grammy winner, but she's also a NASCAR driver. And that's where we make the reasoning mistake. And that's why that restriction, that's an instance of why this restriction exists in the first place. Kind of understanding why the restrictions exist, it's easier for you to use EI correctly, but at the same time, it does just reduce into a certain amount of checks. Whenever you are using EI, make sure that you do not use a variable. Make sure that the name that you've chosen, the lowercase letter that you've chosen, has not appeared in your proof so far, wherever you're at. It just has to be new to the proof so far. And then lastly, check the conclusion of the argument. Make sure that the conclusion does not contain the individual that you used for EI.